The Pureblood Pretense. Chapter 1. Has one of my father's pranks turned your brains to porridge? Archerus Rigel Black clamped a hand over his cousin's mouth while glancing about the musty hallway anxiously. You can't just say things like that in the open, Harry. Don't you know what your mum would do to us if she heard? Harriet Potter allowed herself to be pulled down the hall, up the narrow staircase, and into Archie's bedroom, quite used to her cousin's dramatics. Her mother was safely out of earshot in the parlor with her fathers and uncles, and it's not as if the decapitated heads of house elves past were going to rat them out, but when Archie wanted drama, drama was created. She waited patiently while Archie dragged the chest of drawers over to barricade the door and settled for a very small eye roll when he stuffed his handkerchief in the keyhole for good measure. Now. Okay, now. He plopped down on the bed as if the last 5 minutes had exhausted him beyond endurance and stared at her through his untidy fringe. Please tell me you weren't joking. She took in his pathetically hopeful expression with a small smile. I wasn't. I convinced Mum and Dad that I want to attend the American Institute of Magic. Not that it had been a hard sell, there were only so many foreign schools of magic, and those that took half-bloods and muggle-borns readily were almost exclusively located in the liberal United States. The fact that she was showing any amount of enthusiasm for a school other than Hogwarts was a great relief to her parents at this point. I can't believe it. Archie flopped back onto the covers and blinked at the ceiling like an owl dazed by the sun. It's happening. I'm really going to be a healer. Harry, he took a deep, steadying breath. I don't know how I'll ever thank you. Harry reached out to pat her cousin gently on the hand. You're helping me just as much, remember. Without you taking my place at AIM, I couldn't take yours at Hogwarts. Right, guess not. Archie laughed a bit breathlessly and a grin lit up his round face with mischief. So, what's next? Harriet pulled out a well-worn piece of parchment from her pocket. She took quill and ink from Archie's nightstand and crossed off lie through teeth to parents from their list. Archie had written the list, which explained why Jump with Joy was the only item apart from Become a Girl that wasn't crossed off. Well, she said, we can't switch trunks until the night before we leave, so other than getting hold of the Polyjuice potion, that's it. Okay, Archie said slowly, so when I get to AIM, I'll tell the headmistress that whoever transcribed the forms overflew messed up, and my name's Harry, not Harriet. They won't know the English Book of Gold well enough in America to think anything of it. Right. What I don't get is how you, here Archie pointed skeptically in the general direction of her face, are going to be me. Because you're so unique, Harry said dryly. Everyone knows of the black air, but you don't really have any friends. Oh. Besides me, and I inherited enough pure-blooded features from my dad to pass even Lord Malfoy's scrutiny, she finished, tilting her nose up to emphasize the aforementioned good breeding. Archie narrowed his eyes in mock judgment. Yes, this one does have the pure-blood nose and cheekbones. The eyes are a bit vulgar, if only they were a stately grey rather than that common green hue, but the perfectly pointed chin more than makes up for it. But the hair. Oh, dear Merlin, never did a pure-blood see the like. Harry tossed a pillow lazily at his snobby expression. Our hair is the same color, black as your family name. It's not the color that's the problem, he chuckled. It's the texture. The Potter mop is quite distinctive. It's not that bad, Harry said, scowling defensively as her cousin gave her an expression of patent disbelief. Archie shook his head ruefully. Sorry, cause, but anyone in England who sees that hair will right away associate it with your father. His picture's in the paper too often. The hair has to go if you want to pass as me. But you have long hair. She frowned, fingering a shoulder-length lock. It'll seem odd if you suddenly wear it short. We'll make it a grand gesture. Tomorrow you and I are both cutting our hair in honor of the end of our childhood. With luck, it'll make you look like a girlish boy and me like a boyish girl, Archie said. She noted he didn't sound enthusiastic at the prospect. Harry grimaced herself, just imagining the look on her mother's face when they came back from the salon. There was nothing for it, though. They had to look as alike as possible, if this plan of theirs was going to last beyond the first term. Once their ruse got underway, a few inches of hair was going to seem like nothing compared to some of the other things they'd have to do. -0. HP. -0. The next day, She and Archie went to one of the Diagon barber shops and said goodbye to their long, and in Harry's case unruly, hair. Before she knew it, the wayward crow's nest her father always tousled when she came near was gone. In its place were close-cropped locks that curled gently around her forehead and ears. I look too delicate with my face all exposed. Harriet frowned while squinting at herself in the mirror. They'll know I'm a girl. They won't, Archie assured her, admiring his own shorter style. She had to admit that, put next to one another, there was a remarkable similarity between the two of them. Not enough for their parents to mistake them, but enough to put doubt into a stranger, perhaps. Pure-blooded children generally have delicate features anyway. You only think you look exposed because you're used to that lion's mane overwhelming your features. He reached over from the chair next to her and plucked the glasses from her face. There, don't we look like twins? I can't see anything without my glasses, she said, rolling blurry eyes. Archie grinned. That's going to be a problem. We need to get you contacts, I'm thinking steel-colored or maybe argent. He peered at himself in the mirror thoughtfully. What do you think? Do I look like an argent to you? You look like an idiot to me, Harry informed him. Well, you better practice your village idiot expressions, then Archie laughed. Seeing as you have to be me in a few days. Maybe I'll improve you, Harry said, smiling. By the time you're yourself again I'll have set the bar so high people will say what happened to that Archie Black. He was so collected in school and now he seems rather buffoonish. Careful, cousin, or I might do something novel to your reputation, too, Archie threatened with an answering grin. Do your worst, Harry shrugged. I'll just assume your identity permanently. Archie grimaced. Can we make every effort to not have that happen? No offense to womankind, but I really don't want to be a girl forever. You're not actually going to be a girl, she reminded him. I'm the one who has to lie about my gender for 7 years. They both lapsed into a thoughtful silence, the full scope of their intentions beginning to creep past their mental defenses. It'll be worth it, Archie said at last, just before the hairdresser returned with their bill. It will, she agreed. It would have to be. -0. AB. -0. Their last night at home arrived quickly, and Archie packed up everything he could possibly need for a school he wouldn't ever be attending. He had mixed feelings about their ruse, despite his readiness to go forward with it. The prospect of lying to his dad for the next 7 years was an unhappy one. Now that Mum was gone, he was all his dad had left, and if their deception was discovered it would likely cause a rift in their relationship, but on the other hand, it's not as if they were hurting anyone. Harry got to chase her dream of studying under Master Snape, and AIM had the best healer certification track of any Western magical school. By the time he graduated he'd be a fully qualified Mediwizard, several years ahead of an equivalent student of Hogwarts standards. Well, he would be if the two of them could pull it off, that is. When he'd finished packing what was essentially Harry's trunk, he and his dad went over to Potter's place in Godric's Hollow for dinner. Uncle Remus was already there, setting the table. Of course, Remus wasn't really his uncle, nor was James, come to that, but they all considered one another family, so exact blood relations didn't really matter. So are you psyched to go to school, Archie? James asked once they'd all sat down at the table. Lily nudged him reprovingly with her elbow, glancing at Harry with unveiled concern, but James grinned reassuringly at his wife and continued talking over the spread. You're going to love Hogwarts, no place like it anywhere. Why, the things me and your uncle and father got up to when we were there. As the representative of the second generation of marauders, you'll have to carry on the family legacy of pranking the daylights out of unsuspecting defense against the dark arts professor's Sirius cut-in, barking out a laugh and slapping Remus, who was sitting next to him, on the back in reminiscence. Remus shook his head exasperatedly at his best friend, but didn't say anything to rebuke him. Archie knew it was Remus' opinion that Sirius laughed much too early. Lady Black, Archie's mother, had passed away a few years ago of a rare wasting sickness, and his dad really hadn't been the same since. Neither had he, for that matter. Why just the defense professors? Archie asked, playing along. Is that part of the tradition? Not really. It's just that they're usually the best targets. James rubbed his neck in thought. See, the job's been cursed as long as anyone can remember, so you never get the same 1-2 years in a row. and rookie professors are the easiest marks. Sirius winked at his son. Though if you want to prank Snivellus once or twice your old man would be much obliged. Don't call him that, Sirius, Lily said automatically, her tone revealing the frequency with which she had to make the request. He's a good man. Not to mention a genius, Harry added quietly into her fish. No one acknowledged this remark, as it, too, was commonplace. Harry had been in a state of near idol worship with their dad's old school rival ever since she read an article in Potions Quarterly about his work with the Wolfsbane potion. His cousin came off as dull and uninteresting, if not downright cold, to most people, but she had harbored a deep fascination for potions. She'd been spending the better part of her free time stirring up unlikely concoctions in her parents' basement for as long as he could remember. Archie knew his cousin wanted nothing in the world but to brew potions for the rest of her life, preferable alone, but in her mind mediocrity in the art was not enough. The only way to become the greatest potions mistress in the country was to study under the greatest potions master in the country, and he, if you believed Harry's judgment on the subject, was at Hogwarts. Archie could relate to her single-mindedness on the subject. He felt much the same about healing. 11 years later and you're still defending the man, James sighed. 11 years later and you're still holding on to a childish rivalry, Lily returned, looking to Remus for support. Remus thinks it's ridiculous, don't you? She has a point, the werewolf said mildly. He glanced between James and Sirius with a slight smile. There's no need to perpetuate this, is there? I'm sure by now he's washed his hair. Sirius and James burst into fresh gales of laughter, and Lily gave Remus an exasperated, thanks for nothing stare. He held his hands up in surrender and cheerfully changed the subject. So, Harry, how are you looking forward to America? Can't wait, the newly shorn girl said, glancing up at Archie before continuing, it'll be interesting to travel abroad. I'm, actually thinking of trying the healer track. Really? Remus chewed thoughtfully as her parents exchanged confused looks. That's quite a difficult area of specialization. I thought you were planning on pursuing a potions career, though. Well, all the really advanced healing is done with potions nowadays, Harry said, toying casually with her vegetables. If I want to make potions to help people, not just brew them for money, then I should see the problem from the other side, too. Archie didn't think she was lying, she almost never did, directly. She had mentioned wanting one day to be able to help people with the potions she invented, and Mediwizards did rely heavily on potions for the more complicated cures, but he knew if it weren't for him she wouldn't even consider a specialty in healing. That was all Archie. After watching his mother suffer for months under the influence of an illness there was no viable treatment for, he became obsessed with the idea of one day saving lives. When he first decided he wanted to be a healer one day, he'd asked his father if he could accompany Harry to a school in America instead of taking the place reserved for him at Hogwarts. Sirius wouldn't hear of it. Archie thought his father's unusual unreasonableness on the subject was a combination of his fear that he'd be losing his son in a way, too, if he went so far away, and his desire for Archie to have the same wonderful experiences he'd had in school. Hogwarts was where Sirius had met his best friends, James and Remus, and where he'd met and fallen in love with Diana, Archie's mother. Their arguments on the subject of Archie's schooling had become so sour that when Harry had first idly suggested switching places to solve both their frustrations, Archie considered it seriously. He didn't want to disappoint his dad, but Sirius lived his life in the past, and Archie couldn't change that. He knew he could never bring his mum back. He might be able to one day be the difference that saved someone else's loved one, however, and to see that dream become a reality he'd lie to the whole world if he had to. After dinner the two cousins went up to Harry's room for a private goodbye. They wouldn't see one another until winter break at the earliest, and they had never been apart that long before. The long separation wasn't at the forefront of their minds, however. Did you get your dad to shrink yours, too? Harry asked, producing a miniaturized trunk from a bookshelf. Archie produced his miniaturized trunk from his pocket and exchanged it for Harry's thankfully not too feminine one. They wouldn't be unshrunk until they reached their respective schools the following evening. Did you nick the potions from Uncle James or a kit? This was the part of their plan he was least sure about. Unlike the rest of it, which seemed fairly innocent, stealing was so obviously wrong. He supposed he'd better get used to living in a state of moral grayness. Here. Harry pulled out 2 beakers from under her bed, pouring doses of the mud-brown liquid into vials, one for each of them. You'll have to keep the beaker hidden. I've replaced it with a neutral concoction that smells and tastes as bad, but doesn't do anything. Hopefully he'll assume it's a defective batch. Archie nodded his understanding and they both plucked hairs without further ado. Switching vials, they each drank the dose with the other's essence. The transformation was more painful than he'd anticipated, but soon enough it was over and he felt as if he were looking into a mirror. Weird. Archie squinted his newly green eyes. You have awful eyesight, Harry. Give me your glasses. That explains why the world's so blurry. Harriet took off her spectacles and blinked at the world around her, apparently enjoying her now perfect vision. Archie put the glasses on with a sigh of distaste. It would only be for a little while. They had enough stolen polyjuice to last until they were safely away from their parents the next morning, and after that Harriet had the contacts he'd gotten her to correct her vision and change her eye color to an unremarkable gray, while he had green contacts for thoroughness sake. He wasn't expecting to run into anyone at AIM who had even heard of the Potters. Harry was the one who would have the hard time pulling off their deception. I packed extra potions books into my trunk for you, so study up in case Mum mentions something in a letter I should know about, Harry said. Don't forget to learn a handwriting charm first thing so you can answer my parents' correspondence, and I'll do the same for the letters your dad sends. Keep an extra copy of what you write and we'll exchange them by I'll post at the end of the school year so we can keep our stories straight over the summer. All right, I remember, Archie said. Honestly, Harry acted as though it fell to her to take his mum's place sometimes. Not that he minded much. He could see through her in any case. Harry was more nervous than she looked if she was rambling out instructions they'd already agreed upon. That's it then. This is, goodbye. Harry looked a little lost for a moment, but quickly pulled it together to give him a firm, good luck. Yeah. Archie felt a bit lost himself at the magnitude of what they were about to undertake. Arch. Yeah. Harry took a deep breath. Even if this blows up in our face and they kick me out before the first class, I'm saying right now, I don't regret anything. Archie was taken aback at her forthrightness, but squared his 11-year-old shoulders nonetheless. Me neither. Thank you. This was your idea and without it I would have taken years longer to reach my goal. It's also going to be a lot more dangerous for you, and, well, I'm grateful for everything, no matter what happens. Same. Thanks for letting me borrow your name, Arch, Harry said, lightening the air between them with a lame attempt at levity. I'll try not to blacken it too much in the next 7 years. Do your worst, Archie said, grinning. -0. HP. -0. Harry ducked into the boys' bathroom on the Hogwarts Express and waited in a stall for the polyjuice to wear off. Every moment seemed like an eternity, but she knew that was just her nerves getting the best of her. When she was herself again, she changed into Archie's school robes and moved out to the sink to blink her new lenses into place. Staring back at her from the mirror was a sober-looking 11-year-old boy with a halo of onyx curls and flat, grey eyes. Her eyelashes were perhaps a bit too long to be masculine, but the lips were thin enough and the fragile bone structure could have belonged to any number of pure bloodlines. She'd heard the Malfoys in particular were known for their pointed faces. Her voice was too high-pitched at first, but with a little practice it dropped slightly to a more natural octave for a young boy. Satisfied, she exited the restroom and began to walk the length of the train looking for a spare compartment. Glancing around at all the excited faces, it began to dawn on her that she'd really done it. She'd got as far as the train without discovery, and everyone she met from now on would be complete strangers, so anything she messed up on would simply be attributed to Archirus Black's unknown character. She pondered that for a moment. Archirus Black. Archirus Rigel Black. She wrinkled her nose. It felt too strange to be taking Archie's name. A name he didn't even like, no less. Should she refer to herself in her head as Archie, just to lessen the chance that she'd get confused and mess up? But then how would she refer to Archie? After thinking on it for a long moment, she decided that as long as she was appropriating Archie's person she might as well be decisive about it. As long as she was playing Archie's part, she would go by his middle name. From now on I'll be Rigel Black, the best potions student Hogwarts has ever seen. Rigel, and wasn't it odd to rename herself in her own thoughts for convenience's sake, was nearly to the end of the train before she saw what looked like a promising compartment. There was only one boy sitting quietly within, reading what she recognized as the first-year herbology textbook. She slid open the door and nodded slightly in greeting when the boy looked up. He had an open, cheerful face, with lank brown hair that fell across his forehead and plain brown eyes that held not a hint of malice. There was something familiar about it, but she didn't dwell long on what. "Are you saving these seats for anyone?" she asked. No." The kid looked surprised that she would think that. "You can sit, if you want." "Thank you." She shut the door and took a seat across from him. "I'm Rigel," she said, trying out the name for the first time aloud. "Neville." He smiled tentatively, and looked as though he would say something else, but refrained. He was probably used to giving his last name when introducing himself, she figured. Most purebloods gave their family name as a courtesy, according to Archie. She'd rather not bring up her borrowed last name just yet, however. Chances were either he was a light-raised kid and would automatically hate anyone named Black, or his dark pureblood parents had told him the only blacks left were blood traitors. "Pleased to meet you. Is that 1,000 magical herbs and fungi?" Rigel nodded at the book in Neville's lap. He glanced down at it as if to check, but caught himself and flushed. "Yeah. Have you read much of it yet?" "I have," she said, then backtracked as the boy looked significantly alarmed. "I don't think you need to have read any of it, though. I was only interested because herbology has a lot to do with potions." "Oh." Neville looked much relieved. "So you like potions, then?" "I read the introduction to that textbook, too, but it looks quite complicated. And the first potion listed uses toad parts." "I have a toad. His name is Trevor," the boy explained. "I don't know if I like the idea of dissecting animals for parts." "You won't have to do the harvesting, most likely. The professor will have the ingredients already," Rigel said. "You think? Maybe it won't be so bad, then." Neville swung his feet a bit nervously, then blurted, "What house do you think you'll be sorted into?" "I'm hoping for Slytherin," she said honestly. "You, Slytherin?" Neville squeaked. "From that reaction, I'm guessing your family are Gryffindors." "So are mine," Rigel admitted. "And you're actually hoping for Slytherin?" He looked half doubtful, half confused. "The potions master at Hogwarts is the head of Slytherin House," she explained. "I've heard he favors his own house, so the best chance I have at getting extra tutoring from him is to be in Slytherin." "You'd go against your line for some extra help in potions?" Neville bit his lip. "Can you even do that? Pick your house against tradition, I mean." "Maybe not, but I think I can meet the requirements if I get the chance. I just have to be cunning and ambitious, right?" The last bit was facetious, but she didn't think Neville noticed. "Well, good luck," he offered kindly. "Thank you," she said. "I hope you like the house you get, as well." They spent the rest of the trip in comfortable silence. The only interruption was when Neville quietly asked if Rigel would leave so he could change into his school robes. Rigel didn't mind stepping outside to wait if it made the shy boy more comfortable, though she was quite desensitized to the male form thanks to her growing up with Archie's complete lack of modesty. While she was standing outside the compartment, a tall boy with deep-set features and a surly expression approached from the left end of the train. Due to the narrowness of the corridor, she was partially blocking his way. Instead of just walking around her, however, he veered and slammed a heavily muscled shoulder into her side. Not expecting it, she fell sideways to the ugly carpet and awkwardly broke her fall with her elbows. Pushing herself back up to her knees, she glared at the boy, who was sneering down at her. "Are you blind?" she asked, remembering to pitch her voice deeper, the way Archie's went when he got angry, just in time. The moment the older boy's eyes narrowed, she knew she shouldn't have said that. The other boy was much larger and meaner looking than any kid she'd ever met, and despite her reluctance to take open hostility lying down, she had to admit that her position was rather precarious to be openly hostile with anyone. The bigger boy advanced on her almost casually, whipping a foot toward her middle. Only a swift roll in the opposite direction saved her from a bruised rib or two. She got to her feet and rounded on the kid, who could have been maybe a 5th or 6th year. My apologies, she said through gritted teeth, thinking to defuse the situation. Obviously you're not blind, just rather upset, but there's no need to take it out on me. He took a step toward her with clenched fists, then paused and pulled out his wand instead, a nasty smirk on his face. Little first years should know better than to talk faster than their wands can move. Consider this your first lesson: when an upperclassman kicks you, stay down. I might if I thought it would make you go away, Rigel thought resignedly, stiffening her spine and preparing to take whatever curse he tossed her way. Before either of them could make a move, a stern voice from down the train broke in. You, there. No fighting on the train. A thin, red-headed boy with a gleaming gold badge on his chest strutted importantly up to stand between Rigel and the surly boy, neither of whom had relaxed their stance. Flint, the redhead said upon catching sight of the other boy's face. I might have known. I'll be taking 10 points from Slytherin when we get to Hogwarts for pulling your wand on another student, and a first year, no less. Flint curled his lip at the boy. Weasley. Apparently that was enough said in his opinion, for he turned and stalked off, with one last annoyed glare in Rigel's direction. Nothing but trouble this time of year, that one sighed the freckled boy. He looked down at Rigel with a slight frown. You all right there? Bad luck getting in Flint's way your first day. He likes to hold a grudge for a little while, so be sure to steer clear for a few weeks, okay? I certainly won't go seeking him out, she said, straightening her robes. Thank you for the intervention. It was no trouble, the boy said airily. I was only doing my duty as a prefect. Rigel nodded once more in thanks, then turned to rejoin Neville in their compartment. If he wondered why she'd stayed out for so long, he didn't say anything. She reclaimed her seat quietly, lost in thought. Not even to Hogwarts yet, and she'd already made an enemy. She hoped fervently this wasn't a sign of more such instances to come. She also hoped Archie was faring better with his side of the ruse, wherever he was. -0, 0, 0. -0, -0. -0. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. As the train began to slow, she could see the lights of Hogsmeade Station in the distance. Compartment doors began to slam open one after another, so she and Neville joined the crowd pushing toward the exits. They got separated from one another in the crush, and by the time she'd departed the train, the small boy was nowhere to be seen. A man larger than anyone Rigel had ever seen led them to the shore of a deep-water lake, where tiny wooden boats awaited them. She wound up sharing a boat with a pair of girls and a freckled boy with the same shade of red hair as the prefect she'd met on the train. She tried not to wonder if the rickety old things were seaworthy, but the fact that the boats moved forward under a kind of mass hypnotic spell didn't burgeon her faith in the crafts. Once safely ashore, she and the others followed the giant man, Hagrid, up to the castle. It was bigger than she'd imagined, but other than its size, she wasn't able to gain much impression of it in the dark. The great doors beckoned them inside, and they stood quietly in the entrance hall until a stern-faced woman, who introduced herself as the Transfiguration Professor, McGonagall, came out to collect them. She herded them into a line in no particular order and led them through the big oak doors into the great hall. Rigel's eyes widened involuntarily at the sheer number of students in the hall. She'd thought there would be a lot fewer, with the school only accepting purebloods now, but she supposed not many people married out of magic these days. It just wasn't done. She'd heard that not so long ago about 50% of wizarding children were half-bloods. Now most of the Muggle blood had been bred out of the gene pool once more, so Muggleborns and half-bloods like herself only made up about 20% of the population. There were 4 long tables that took up the bulk of the hall, and a smaller, perpendicularly placed table at the far end of the room that looked to be for professors and staff. As the students gracing each table seemed to be sorted according to tie color, Rigel deduced the seating arrangements were separated by house. She glanced about the room in general to avoid looking at anyone directly as they were led to a spot in front of the head table designated by a lump of fabric sitting on a short stool. The ceiling caught her eye and she sucked in her breath quietly. It looked as though the whole galaxy had been brought down to fill the hall. Such stars as she'd never seen before graced the Empyrean. She'd heard that out in the wilderness, away from the lights of the cities, the stars and planets shone brighter, but she'd never imagined it would be such a spectacle. Just when she had come to think perhaps there was no ceiling, only empty space, a nudge from behind brought her back to her surroundings. A girl with short blonde hair cut at a fashionable angle away from her face leaned close to whisper, "It's enchanted to look like the sky outside, but if you don't stop gaping like a fish at it, everyone will think you're a commoner before you even get sorted." Rigel turned her artificial grey eyes to meet amused blue ones. The blonde girl was obviously from one of the more prominent pureblood families. Everything from the articulate way she spoke to the poised way she held herself suggested hours upon hours of social instruction as a child. The other girl smiled to show she wasn't trying to be catty, but helpful, so Rigel nodded to show she was grateful for the advice. She was about to introduce herself properly when her words were cut off. The lump of fabric on the stool had begun to sing loudly. "Welcome, welcome, one and all, to this fine place, in this great hall. Yes, it's that time of year once more, when I help Master Dumbledore to place you where you need to be. The house that is your destiny. To those of you who always yearn to know as much as you can learn, who seek the truth in every way, and plan to study every day. Don't worry, here you're not alone. In Ravenclaw you'll find your home. To any who have talent, yes, and always try to do their best, who only take the things they earn, and wait with patience for their turn, and value loyalty and trust. Why, you belong in Hufflepuff. If you know that you have ambition, and a cunning disposition, if you keep your secrets close, and know that wisdom never boasts, and want to find your truest friends, then you must go to Slytherin. To those of you with steady nerve, the stout of heart who never swerve from any duty come their way, who aren't afraid to speak their say, and meet the danger at their door, you will be great in Gryffindor. So come to me and put me on. I've never once been told I'm wrong. I'll find inside your deepest soul the house able to make you whole. Maybe it's not a pretty sight, but this old hat will steer you right." The hall broke into thunderous applause, all the first years joining in with bemusement. "We just have to try it on." The redhead she'd shared a boat with laughed. "That's easy." Professor McGonagall pulled a scroll from her robes and unrolled it. "When I call your name, come forward, sit on the stool, and try on the hat. Abbott, Hannah." A mouser-looking blonde girl with pigtails aquiver stepped forward nervously and sat on the stool. She gingerly placed the hat on her head, wrinkling her nose a bit as though she'd encountered a foul smell. "Hufflepuff," the hat cried. "So whatever you do, don't think about how bad the hat smells or it'll punish you by sending you to the badgers," the short-haired girl from earlier whispered into Rigel's ear. She had to bite her lip to hide her slight smile of amusement. "Black, Archerus." Rigel smoothed her face into an expression of detached politeness, by far the easiest neutral expression to maintain while nervous, and stepped forward toward the stool Abbott had just vacated. Her last thought before putting the hat on was that it didn't really smell that bad. "Why thank you, young lady," the hat murmured in her head. If she weren't so tense, she would have jumped, but she kept the blank mask on her face while thinking to the hat, "You're not going to kick me out, are you? Please let me stay. I'll work hard, I promise." "Calm down, Miss Potter, I'm not a snitch, I'm a hat. I'm here to sort you, not pass judgment on your life choices. Now, let's see. You do have quite a bit of talent, and you're willing to work hard, but I can see that you have greater ambitions than self-satisfaction. It was courageous of you to risk so much to be here, and clever to have planned it out so perfectly, but above all sneaky, so very sly. I know just where to put someone with so many secrets to keep. Good luck in Slytherin." Rigel stood calmly, though on the inside she was weak with relief. She carefully removed the hat after a whispered, "Thank you," and turned toward the table that was clapping. On the way, her eyes met those of the girl she'd been standing next to, who mouthed, "Good job," at her and subtly mimed holding her breath to avoid a stinky smell. She told herself it was rude to laugh at Hufflepuffs as she took a seat at the end of the Slytherin table. There was an array of empty places around her, presumably for the other new first years. They were who she should be focusing on, the other students who would soon become her housemates, not the ones made Hufflepuffs. Still, when Bones, Susan went to Hufflepuff after a similarly distasteful expression on her face, Rigel's lips twitched upwards at the corners without her conscious control. Before long, she was joined by Bulstrode, Millicent and Crabbe, Vincent, Tracy Davis, Daphne Greengrass, and Gregory Gull all quickly followed. After that, there was a lull until a sharply put-together boy with platinum blonde hair and a confident expression strode forward to the tune of "Malfoy, Draco." Davis and Greengrass, whom Rigel had already pegged as uninteresting lackwits based on their discussing the merits of linen versus silk tablecloths upon claiming their seats, made small swooning noises as they watched the Malfoy scion put the hat on without even bothering to sit. The hat seemed to shout, "Slytherin," before it even touched his perfectly groomed hair, and Rigel thought she might not have bothered to sit down either if she had been that sure of the outcome. Malfoy's eyes scanned the table coolly as he approached. Across the table, the large boys Crabbe and Goyle moved over hastily to make room between them, which left Rigel staring straight into slate-grey eyes as the heir to one of the oldest and most influential dark pureblood families slid into the seat directly across from her. He nodded slightly in her direction, and she was nonplussed until she realized that, with her as Archerus Black, they were cousins through Draco's mother, Narcissa Malfoy née Black. She nodded back just as slightly and both turned their attention to the sorting once more as not, Theodore was made a Slytherin as well. When Parkinson, Pansy was called, the girl who'd warned her about acting like a peasant moved gracefully toward the stool. Her sorting took only slightly longer than Malfoy's, though she made a great show of sitting primly on the stool and adjusting the hat on her head before brushing off imaginary lint from its brim as she set it back on the stool. Rigel moved over just enough to extend an invitation to sit beside her without seeming eager about it, and Parkinson politely smiled her thanks as she sat to Rigel's left and tucked her robes gracefully beneath her. "I knew you were Slytherin material," Parkinson confided quietly, seeming content to ignore the sorting for the time being. "Oh really?" Rigel lifted an eyebrow in the manner she'd seen Archie appropriate when he was in pureblood mode. "And how did you figure that while I was gaping like a country bumpkin?" "There. Let the girl think she took the comment as a compliment." The blonde girl twinkled prettily at her. "I just know these things," she said. "For instance, I can tell you that there's only one student left over there who will join us at this table, and he won't be called until the very end, so you can stop trying to divide your attention between me and the hat." Rigel let herself blink once at the other girl. "You're quite perceptive, Miss Parkinson." "Call me Pansy," the blonde said after a considering pause. "We are, after all, going to be great friends, Mr. Black." "All of my great friends call me Rigel," she said, trying out a grin that was based on her uncle's serious roguish expressions. It must have worked, because Pansy looked ever so slightly taken aback for a moment before allowing a wry smile to grace her aristocratic features. "You are certainly your father's son, Rigel." "Do you know my father?" She feigned surprise. "I shall have to chastise him for keeping such a gem to himself." She was laying it on pretty thick, and she honestly hoped what people said about first impressions was true and she never had to act like this again, because it was making her feel a bit queasy. It was necessary that people believed she was the son of Sirius Black, however, so for a little while she would channel her uncle's irrepressible spirit. Suffice it to say that every girl at this table has been warned by her mother to steer clear of the Black Scion if she wishes to keep her reputation intact. Pansy smiled with amusement, not seeming too concerned about steering clear herself. "But I think you're all talk." She made a mental note to ask Sirius what he'd done at Hogwarts that had mothers a decade later fearing for their daughter's virtue in the presence of an 11-year-old. Though, on the other hand, she supposed she'd rather not know. "I'm grateful that you've decided to look past those unmitigated rumors and give me a chance," Rigel chose to say. Whatever reply Pansy might have made was forgotten as Zabinai, Blaise was sorted into Slytherin, and McGonagall took the hat and stool away. As Dumbledore stood to make his opening speech, Pansy and Rigel turned their attention his way. With her face looking toward the headmaster's chair, Rigel couldn't help but notice, from the corner of her eye, the scrutinizing gaze one Draco Malfoy was leveling at her from across the table. He must have been very curious about the cousin he'd never met, she thought. Dumbledore was clearly an eccentric. His long, white beard was braided with ribbons in the 4 house colors and his pointed hat was covered with tropical flowers and birds. He said a few words, the impenetrability of which suggested that he chose them randomly from the dictionary, and waved his hands dramatically. Immediately, the tables in front of them filled with every imaginable kind of food. Starters, soups, entrees, desserts, and drinks were spread before them in a chaotic mess, and as children all around the hall began grabbing whatever was closest to them, she wondered if the randomness of placement wasn't intended. Rigel put her napkin in her lap, noting that all the napkins at the Slytherin table were black, and therefore wouldn't leave noticeable residue on black school robes the way a white napkin would have. She supposed she could get used to such details. Across the table, Crabbe and Goyle were stuffing themselves with chocolate confections, not even bothering with plates, while the blonde boy between them slowly piled a variety of foods onto his plate, as though he was playing diplomat to each food group and was reluctant to show favoritism. Rigel asked Greengrass to pass the garden salad and, although the girl blinked at Rigel entirely too many times in the process, she did hand it over. Rigel piled her plate high with the leaves and dug in. When she finished the plate and was still hungry, she helped herself to another serving of leafy goodness, ignoring the plate of steaming chicken legs directly before her. "Don't you want anything more substantial than that?" Pansy glanced askance at her plate with obvious curiosity. Rigel swallowed carefully before answering. "No, thank you." Pansy waited a beat, but when it became clear that Rigel had no intention of elaborating, she shrugged and turned to her own dinner. Rigel was both impressed and amused at the other girl's expression of studied disinterest, so she offered, "I'm a vegetarian." Pansy turned back with raised eyebrows. "Is that so? You don't eat any meat?" the dark-haired girl, Bulstrode, asked, glancing down at her own steak and kidney pie as if she couldn't bear the thought of giving it up forever. "I eat some fish," Rigel said. The sturdy girl only shook her head mournfully in response and turned back to her own dinner. Rigel had debated whether or not to change her diet for this masquerade, but eventually decided against it. For one, she wasn't sure if she could fake a liking for meat for 7 years, and for another, her vegetarian diet would go a long way toward explaining why she remained so small and scrawny while the other boys were growing taller and broader. Archie wasn't a vegetarian, but no one here would know that, and if it somehow got back to Sirius that his son's eating habits had changed, she could always say she had done it out of nostalgia for her cousin. It was the kind of thing Archie would do in a fit of dramatics. She finished her dinner quietly, finding the pumpkin juice to be dessert enough for her, and almost didn't notice when the Malfoy once again turned his considering gaze her way. He wasn't very subtle, however, and after his second obvious glance Rigel noticed Pansy noticing it, too. Pansy didn't look surprised that Malfoy might be curious about Rigel, so she supposed all the kids here must know the intricate system of blood connections that bound them to one another. By the time everyone had finished eating, it was quite late, and Rigel was more than ready to go to sleep. Even her nerves at having come this far couldn't make her listen with more than half an ear to Dumbledore's informational speech about rules, forbidden forests, and so on. When they were finally released, she fell into step beside Pansy as they and the other first years followed the Slytherin prefects into the dungeons. By the time they reached the entrance to the common room, she was freezing as well as sleepy. Didn't they heat anything below the kitchens? One of the prefects, a girl with long, black hair and heavy eye makeup, turned and addressed their group. "This is the common room. You probably won't be able to find it on your own for a few weeks because it just looks like a blank stretch of wall, but that's to stop the other houses from finding it, so whatever you do don't draw a map or place markers along the corridors to find your way back." She said it in such a way that Rigel suspected the rules were based on experience. "Just follow an older Slytherin until you learn your way around. Don't be too proud to ask directions," either another prefect added. The upper years had to do the same thing when they were first years. In this house, no one expects you to figure everything out on your own like a Ravenclaw, but, on the other hand, we're not Hufflepuffs. If you want help, you have to ask, and don't expect it to be free. "The password is Ouroboros," said the first prefect. She stood to the side as the wall slid open and blessedly warm air from the common room wafted out into the corridor. If keeping the corridors in the dungeons uncommonly cold was some sort of psychological trick to make them associate the common room with cozy hospitableness, she couldn't fault its execution. They all shuffled inside gratefully, and the prefects herded them over to one of the great fireplaces along the walls to get their bearings and warm up. The common room was very dark, with the light of flickering flames from the torches and fires casting eerie shadows over every surface. Once she grew accustomed to the low lighting, though, she found it quite elegant, if a little claustrophobic due to the low ceilings. The windows didn't help, since all they revealed at the moment was pitch-black lake water, but she supposed more light would filter down from the surface during the day. The furniture she thought well suited to house Slytherin. All of it was low-backed, so that it would be obvious who was in each seat even from behind, and none of it was cluttered too closely together or tucked way back into corners. There was nowhere to hide. Thankfully, the furnishings were made of basic, dark woods that left the green and silver fabric scheme something short of garish. 7 different hallways led off like spokes on half a wheel from the main room. One for each year, she figured. The prefect with the long, black hair came back over to them and said, "Change of plans. Something's come up, so our head of house will hold the start of term meeting in the morning instead of this evening. That means all of you must be up and finished with breakfast 30 minutes early tomorrow, so as soon as you get situated, go to bed. First year dorms are down the hallway all the way to your right. To protect the safety and privacy of Slytherin students, no one but the students in each year can pass through the doorway to their respective halls. Use this privacy wisely, as students who abuse the privilege will find it revoked for all their year mates." She waved them all toward their dorms, saying, "Go on, little snakes, your room assignments are on the outside of the doors. Oh, and boys, I wouldn't recommend trying to go into one of the girls' dorms. You won't like the consequences. Good night." Rigel tiredly followed Pansy and the others down the first-year hallway. There were 4 doors along the corridor, 2 for the girls, and 2 for the boys. The girls were quite pleased to only be 2 to a room, instead of 3 like the boys, but the only boy who looked put out by the room assignments was Zabinai, who was assigned to a room with Crabbe and Goyle. At the very end of the hall, on the right-hand side, was a door with Archerus Black written right above Draco Malfoy and Theodore Nott, which Rigel pushed open mechanically, making a beeline for the bed with her trunk sitting at the foot. Her roommates filed in behind her and presumably started getting ready for bed, but she didn't pay them any attention. Instead, she went straight to her mattress and was asleep upon it within moments. The relief she felt at having made it all the way to the Slytherin dorms without being kicked out followed her into her dreams, making her smile peacefully as she drifted off to thoughts of what the morning would bring. -0, 0, 0. -0, 0. -0. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. Draco POV. It was the 3rd time Draco Malfoy leveled his gaze at Rigel Black, and still the boy remained unaware. It wasn't just any gaze, either. It was the one his father had taught him, the weighty one, meant to be felt across ballrooms. If Draco hadn't known the black air was raised by blood traitors before, it would have been made obvious by the boy's sheer obliviousness. No child raised in a proper pure-blood house would have been able to sleep through such pointed scrutiny, and each moment he stared, getting not so much as a twitch from the other boy, brought fresh annoyance to Draco's mood. He was supposed to write a letter to his mother this morning about the sorting, and particularly about the black air, but how was he to do that when so far he had nothing to say? He'd walked the train a couple of times before it had left the station, but hadn't seen anyone who looked like the picture of a young Sirius Black from his mother's family tree. He'd not looked again after that, but he had thought he would be able to meet Black at some point before the sorting, or at the very least during dinner if he was sorted into Slytherin like his mother had hoped. But although he'd initiated contact, the head nod in greeting, and given him plenty of impetus to speak to him, the blatant staring at dinner, the dark-haired boy hadn't reacted to his presence at all. And when they ended up in the same room, he thought, now for sure he'll introduce himself like any proper pure-blood would. Nott certainly remembered his manners the night before, but instead, Black went straight to sleep. All in all, Draco Malfoy thought, the other boy was quite irksome, and he didn't know why his mother expected him to befriend Black, just because they were related. Clearly, he wasn't anything resembling company befitting a Malfoy. Finally, at sunrise, Rigel Black began to stir. Draco would have loved to take credit for that, but it appeared the darker boy was used to awakening at such a time, for he looked neither confused nor surprised when he glanced at the watch on his bedside table. Draco thought his father would be proud of him for the patience he showed waiting for Black to notice him. He may as well have been waiting for Goyle to find his brain, however, for Rigel Black apparently had even less self-awareness than he thought. The boy got out of bed and stretched, never once looking around. Draco's short supply of patience ran out when Black started to pick out his clothes for the day, and he cleared his throat with a practiced decorum only a Malfoy could have held on to so early in the day. That got his attention. Draco thought exasperatedly, how did this airhead get into Slytherin? Going somewhere, he said out loud. Black paused, bent over his trunk, a towel slung over his shoulder and a brush in one hand. Yeah, he said, shutting his trunk. He gathered his bundle of clean clothes. Draco inwardly winced at the way perfectly good robes were callously wrinkled, and strode over to the door to their bathroom, stepping inside and shutting it behind him. Draco heard the distinct click of the lock, and huffed grumpily. Well, good morning to you too, Sunshine, he muttered, flinging himself from where he sat on his bed and striding over to the standing wardrobe where he'd unpacked and stored all of his robes the night before. Like any normal person, he thought sourly. Forget the promise he made to his mother. No vague inkling of a political alliance in the future was worth it if that was how Rigel Black was going to be all the time. By the time Draco had brushed out his robes and combed his hair back, and therefore felt like he had regained his dignity, he had calmed down somewhat. 1 week, thought Draco, I'll be friendly and, Merlin forbid, slightly solicitous for 1 week, but after that if Black is still a taciturn little nobody, even Mother can't blame me for moving on to more suitable acquaintanceships. HP. Rigel POV. Rigel leaned back against the closed bathroom door shakily. She didn't think she'd ever been stared at so much in her life. What did Malfoy want? A picture. She'd practically raced to the bathroom to get out from under his heavy gaze. The boy had a glare like a hammer, but a quick look in the mirror showed nothing unusual. No green hair or fangs or subtle suggestion that she wasn't a boy. In short, nothing that would merit such intense scrutiny. Shivering slightly with a feeling of vague foreboding, she checked the lock on the door again and got undressed and into the shower. She was still getting used to how little time she had to spend getting ready in the morning without long hair to deal with, so she'd have to find something to do in the mornings now if she didn't start waking up later. Come to think of it, what was the Malfoy boy doing up so early, besides drilling holes into the back of people's heads with his eyes? Deciding it was none of her business, she got out, dried her hair with a towel, and dressed. As she re-entered the dorm room she was met with a blindingly cheerful smile and a good morning from Nott, who was apparently just as bad in the mornings as Archie, all sunshine and bluebirds. He was waiting with tousled brown hair and a toothbrush in one hand, finished. Yes, she said, moving out of the doorway, did I wake you with the shower? Nor he tossed a grin at her as he brushed past. It was Draco with his Malfoy stare of death. Not sure what to say to that, she merely nodded and continued to her bed, which was between Nott's and Malfoy's, where she hung her towel over the silver canopy to dry. She saw Malfoy glance confusedly at her out of the corner of her eye, but ignored him, thinking he probably had never reused a towel in his life, and so was wondering why she would hang her towel up instead of dumping it in the clothes hamper for the elves. She was forced to rethink her conclusion when he intercepted her on her way to the door. I don't think we've been properly introduced, he said. I'm Draco Malfoy. Rigel Black, she said, pleased to meet you. Are you going to breakfast already? He asked politely, a friendly smile on his face as if he hadn't just practically leapt in front of her to formally introduce himself. It doesn't start for another 20 minutes, I don't think. Unless you have a map of the school, it may take that long for me to find my way, she said, stepping pointedly around him. She knew it was rude beyond belief, but the one thing she didn't need, the one thing that could ruin everything, was attention from the wrong kind of people. And if Malfoy didn't qualify as wrong, she'd eat her potion's ingredients. You could ask an older student, he pointed out to her back. The lack of irritation or censure in his voice impressed her enough that she turned around to face him once more. I doubt they are headed to breakfast this early, she said, feeling ever so slightly vindicated in her curt words when she saw his eyes flash and his lip protrude a tiny bit before the polite smile could distract from it. There was the spoiled child she'd expected of the Malfoy scion. Underneath all his cool, unpracticed artifice was the boy who pouted, however briefly, when things didn't fall into their place at his feet. They would be in 20 minutes, when it starts, he said slowly, his overly patient tone that of someone explaining something he shouldn't have to. You're probably right, she offered him the tiniest of smiles, barely more than a crinkle, and proceeded to turn around and open the door to the first year's hall. Good morning, Mr. Malfoy. She allowed herself another smile, this one genuine, at the look she imagined on his face as she shut the door firmly behind her. She had a habit of imagining other things on two people's faces that she'd picked up from a masquerade party her parents had dragged her to once. Ever since then she'd juxtaposed exaggerated faces and expressions on two people's heads in her imagination whenever she got bored. It was entertaining, if perhaps a bit strange. The common room was indeed deserted. Even though they had to finish breakfast 30 minutes earlier than they would normally in order to meet with their head of house that morning, there wasn't any reason for students to be about before the elves had even begun serving it, so Rigel enjoyed the silence as she crossed to the common room entrance. Faced with the blank wall, she realized she didn't know how to open it from the inside. Ouroboros, she guessed, pleasantly surprised when the wall slid to the side silently. It actually made good sense, she thought as it closed just as quietly behind her. This way, you wouldn't be able to leave the common room without knowing the password to get back in, making it less likely that someone would be caught outside in the cold dungeon air all night. When she had walked far enough to be out of the immediate sight of anyone coming out of the common room, she pulled out the deceptively blank piece of parchment Archie gave her after Sirius had given it to him. James and Sirius had told Archie what it was, reminiscing about the time Filch confiscated it from them. Apparently they'd gone back a few years after they graduated and claimed it as their property, though they never admitted to the old caretaker what it was. They'd gotten rumors to help them improve it, as well, and Archie had explained the new features in Jealous Longing, but the map wouldn't do him any good at AIM, so he'd handed it over, nobly refusing to take her dad's invisibility cloak in return. With the Marauder's map in hand, she traversed the dungeons, thinking she might as well start exploring what was closest to her new home first. After almost 20 minutes had passed, she made a beeline for the staircase that would take her back up to the entrance hall, and from there to the Great Hall. She wiped the parchment clean again and tucked it away as she started to ascend the stairs, and was halfway up when a voice called out from behind her. She glanced over her shoulder to see, not hurrying up the staircase to catch up with her, Malfoy and an older Slytherin the blonde apparently knew quite well, following at a more sedate pace. "Are you just now going up?" Not asked incredulously. "You left ages ago." "The dungeons are quite extensive," she said, as the slower two joined them. "So you've been lost all this time?" the older Slytherin, an athletic-looking boy with common brown hair and eyes, asked, obviously amused. "It's not as if I had a map," she said straight-faced. If Archie were here, he would share the joke. "Well, no better way to learn than to get lost," the boy shrugged, leading the way into the Great Hall. "I'm Adrian Pusey." She took his hand absently. "Rigel Black." Pusey frowned slightly as they found seats near the middle of the Slytherin table. "Forgive me, but I had thought it was Archirus Black." "Rigel is my middle name," she said, noting as she poured herself a glass of milk that her roommates were listening attentively. Not and Pusey exchanged a confused glance when she started eating a bowl of porridge, and they realized that was going to leave it at that. She thought Malfoy's eyebrow might have twitched before he turned to his eggs. Rigel was just finishing up when Pansy walked into the hall. She came to stand behind Nott, who was seated to Rigel's left, and cleared her throat delicately. The lanky boy immediately moved down a bit, crowding the boy on his left to allow Pansy room to sit. She nodded like a queen who had just received a bow from one of her courtiers, and greeted Rigel somewhat coolly. "Good morning, Mr. Black." She served herself a plate of fruit, fussing over which piece of melon she wanted, before continuing, "I was a bit surprised to see that you'd already left this morning." There was an unstated "without me" at the end of that sentence, but if Pansy thought to throw Rigel off, she should have been more direct. There was really nothing she did better than communicating without speaking. "I've always been an early riser," she said. "You weren't there when I left." "I see," Pansy said, "and just what about the early morning do you find so agreeable? Would it be worth my while to rise early as well?" "I find the general lack of noise to be appealing," Rigel said, pretending not to notice Pansy stiffening in offense as she paused to finish her milk before continuing. "It allows one to understand the few things they do here more clearly. I wake early to avoid people, but I would make an exception for you because I value your company and would like to better understand you." Truly, the second half of Rigel's statement might also be interpreted as a desire to have more intimate conversation, away from prying eyes and distractions, but she thought that between their young age and Pansy's good sense she was unlikely to be misunderstood. "There seems to be some value in what you say," Pansy demurred, offering a small smile to show that Rigel had escaped Pansy's irritation for the time being. Her statement was so neutral that it could have meant anything, but Rigel chose to interpret it as a maybe. Whether or not Pansy would rise early with her tomorrow didn't matter. Pansy had gotten what she wanted, an explanation and an invitation, if not an apology. Rigel wondered if she could expect such maneuvering from the blonde every time she became miffed at her. She certainly seemed to be enjoying herself from the smug satisfaction radiating from her every gesture. Rigel inwardly berated herself for forgetting that as a pureblood boy who had made the acquaintance of a pureblood girl, it would be considered expected that she escort her to the next meal they had together, and was glad Pansy hadn't taken her slip as a personal snub. At 35 minutes till the end of breakfast, Slytherin House rose as one and retreated to the dungeons, startling a few first-year Hufflepuffs on their way out of the hall. Their head of house was already present when they arrived. He stood tall and silent in the middle of the common room as the students crowded in and filled the edges of the room. The first years kept together in a group by one of the study tables, unsure what else to do. When the silence had just begun to stretch from expectant to uncomfortable, he spoke. For those of you who do not know, he looked toward their group of 11-year-olds and Rigel found herself riveted against her will. He had a gaze that sprung like a trap if you were foolish enough to let his eyes catch yours. I am Potions Master Severus Snape, your head of house. I apologize for my absence last evening. I was unavoidably detained, as will happen sometimes. Nevertheless, he began to turn in a circle as he talked, including everyone in the room by his gaze alone. As the new term begins, you will be expected to remember, or in the case of our newest members, to discover, what it means to be a Slytherin. To some of you, whose forebears walked these dungeon halls, it means tradition, and to others it simply means unqualified acceptance. But for all of you, Slytherin means a chance to carve and forge your destiny as you see fit. As your head of house, it is my duty to assist you in furthering the ambitions that secured you your place here in this room. For 7 years, your goals are my goals. Your plans and dreams and schemes will become my own motivations, and as long as you dwell herein, I pledge to assist you in realizing all your endeavors. He paused for a moment to let his words, incredible as they were, sink in before continuing. In that vein, if at any time you require assistance, simply seek a portrait of Sir Laser Slytherin, and he will find me. Postast. He gestured to a picture of a dark-haired, green-eyed man hanging above the main fireplace. Rigel mentally looked her new head of house over as he spoke, searching for the telltale signs. Yes, they're in the fireproof robes, and they're in the close-cut fingernails, and even they're in the slight flaring of the nostrils as his nose prepared to inventory the scents in the room. This was truly a potions master. She took in his body language, proud and stiff. He looked more like a general appraising his ranks than any teacher she'd ever heard of. When he turned to directly face the first years, Rigel noted that he was much more menacing in person than he had seemed on paper, with his hawk-like features and looming presence, and yet at the same time his words were so much kinder than she'd expected. In his articles, he spent as much time tossing out acerbic comments about his incompetent contemporaries in the field as he did presenting his revolutionary findings and brilliant deductions. She'd already steeled herself against immediate hostility merely because of who Archie's dad was, but Snape seemed not to have even noticed her. In Slytherin House we stick together, because a lone snake is no match for a lion, an eagle, or, yes, even a badger sometimes. We draw strength from our solidarity, our connections, and any other resources that become available. He paused to smirk in a way that had most of the older students chuckling darkly. There are very few rules in Slytherin that cannot be bent to some extent. One is the policy against inner-house fighting. If you have a problem with a member of your house, settle it with words in private or wands over the holidays. In this school, as far as anyone else is concerned, my snakes do not turn their fangs on one another. Any other issues are considered on a case-by-case basis. When you have crossed a line, you will know it, and pray you have the intelligence not to make the same mistake twice. He bared his teeth in a parody of a grin, and Rigel vowed then and there to never get on his bad side. He nodded, apparently satisfied his point had been received. Indeed, even Malfoy looked like he wanted to squirm, and then he left. The vacuum left behind by his presence was such that it took several seconds after the common room wall slid closed for anyone to move. Finally a prefect cleared his throat and said, "Your schedules should have been delivered to your dorms by now, and whoever has class near the Charms classroom first is responsible for showing the snakelets the way." Rigel met Pansy's gaze, and the blonde raised her eyebrow in a silent question. She took her time, mulling over her impressions as they walked toward their rooms, and finally decided that a shrug was the best reply she could give. Pansy smiled, as if she had expected such a reaction and was already growing fond of it. Rigel supposed she was nothing if not socially predictable. "Well, I think he's cool," Pansy said. "My father tells me he's quite renowned as a potions master, and everyone says he's a good head of house." Not, who was walking behind them, snorted with incredulous amusement. "Everyone in Slytherin, maybe. The rest of the houses think he's a right bastard." Pansy frowned at his language, but merely said, "Who cares what they think? They're wrong." Rigel left them to argue about it, still thinking about her first encounter with her idol. Certainly not. If there was anything Severus Snape wasn't, it was worshipable. Her hero, perhaps. No, too childish. Her future mentor, she decided, with any luck at all. He was just as larger than life in person as she'd imagined, but despite his words about approaching him with their ambitions, there was something inaccessible about him. She couldn't imagine going up to him and demanding his attention, especially considering the last name she was borrowing, and her real last name, for that matter. She'd just have to work twice as hard and make him notice her. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. Malfoy kept pace with her on their way to their first class, Charms. She alternatively walked slightly faster, then slower, to see if he became unconsciously frustrated, but he didn't seem to be thrown off balance. In fact, he adjusted smoothly to her gait each time she modified it, and never missed a conversational beat, not that she was giving him much fodder for conversing with. "Looking forward to class, Black?" Malfoy asked, his tone bland but politely curious. "To Charms." Rigel glanced over at the boy who seemed almost determined to be friendly to her, or to classes in general. Either he smiled in a way that would be charming in a few years, both. Oh, she nodded in exaggerated understanding. "No." This time she was sure his eyebrow twitched. "None of them," he pressed gently, "not even flying. I personally can't wait to show those Gryffindors how Quidditch is supposed to be played." She debated turning the conversation toward his interest in Quidditch, but acknowledged that since he had given her one of his likes, it was only fair to reciprocate. "I suppose I am looking forward to potions," she offered, thinking that the flash of triumph in Malfoy's eyes wasn't at all suspicious. "Potions? It's lucky you're in Slytherin then," he said as they walked into the Charms classroom. She thought perhaps he would leave it at that and go sit with Not or Zabinai, but instead he practically herded her toward the table Pansy had just sat down at, which had 2 extra seats. She ended up in the middle seat and wondered if Malfoy thought sitting her by Pansy would make her comfortable enough to answer all his friendly questions. She also wondered if he was planning on writing up a dossier on her and sending it to his parents, but, as usual, she kept her wonderings to herself. "What's lucky?" Pansy asked, having only caught part of Malfoy's remark. "That Black is in Slytherin, since his interest is in potions." "Yeah, lucky," Rigel thought somewhat ironically. "What's that supposed to mean?" Pansy asked, a small bite to her usually cool voice. Rigel realized she must have voiced her comment out loud, and then realized it sounded like she was sarcastically maligning her house on the first day. This was confirmed when Pansy continued quietly, so as not to let on to others that there was tension between 2 snakes. "You should be proud to be in Slytherin. Just because your dad might not approve." Pansy Rigel interrupted, just as quietly, "I didn't mean I considered myself unlucky to be in Slytherin. I meant it wasn't really luck that I was put here. I wanted to be in Slytherin. Not to mention I exercised more cunning in just coming to Hogwarts than most of the idiots in our year combined. As if I could be put anywhere else." "But your father's a..." She caught herself before she said blood traitor, but the sentiment was there. "Well, why would you want to be in Slytherin?" "Malfoy's already told you that," Rigel said. Malfoy and Pansy shared a look of veiled disbelief. "You wanted to be in Slytherin so that Snape would help you with potions," Malfoy clarified. It was clear he thought that a pretty weak reason for abandoning family values, even if her family was a bunch of blood traitors. Rigel shrugged, grateful that the professor had arrived at last and she could discontinue their conversation. She really hadn't meant to share even that much, but it would be hazardous to her health for the other Slytherins to think she was holding prejudice against her own house. Professor Flitwick was exactly how she might have expected someone with the name Flitwick to appear. He was small and chipper, and began calling roll immediately after hefting himself onto a large stack of books. Rigel thought he must have impeccable balance from perching on top of books all day, which would explain why he was such a superb dueler in his youth. Charms class was much as Rigel had anticipated. The most exciting part of the class was when she asked Professor Flitwick to use Rigel as her first name when he called roll. He explained the theory behind the first charm they were learning, the levitation charm, and set them all to practicing on feathers for the rest of the period. Rigel watched as Pansy and Draco eventually got good enough with their feathers to try dueling with them midair. It wasn't exactly thrilling, as even when the feathers would clash it was with a pathetic, whispering motion, so they got bored of that rather quickly. "Why don't you try, Rigel?" Pansy suggested. "If you don't have it learned you'll only have to do it for homework." "I guess," she sighed, trying to ignore the intent way Malfoy was staring at her feather, as if he had good reason to suspect it was a cleverly disguised bomb. She waved her wand, saying Wingardium Leviosa, but nothing happened. She tried again, and then again several more times, and still nothing. Maybe the feather's made of lead," Pansy said, leaning down until she was eye level with the table. "Wait, I think it moved a bit." "That was you breathing on it," Parkinson Malfoy said. He looked quite disappointed for some reason. "Try again, Black." She did. For the rest of the lesson she practiced until she thought she could perform the wand movement in her sleep. For all the good it did her. "I just don't understand," Pansy kept saying, even as they walked to their next class, History of Magic. "It isn't supposed to be that difficult." "Are you sure you were trying hard enough?" "Yes. Maybe." Rigel suppressed a sigh. She had to get through almost an entire week of these worthless classes before she'd be anywhere near a cauldron. They didn't have potions until Thursday, unfortunately, and even that was only theory. She wouldn't actually get to brew anything until Friday, and that's assuming Professor Snape let them brew the first week. All through History of Magic, Pansy and Malfoy gave her meaningful looks. She didn't know what exactly they meant, but they would look at her, then look at each other, and then look back at her, and it certainly seemed to mean something to them, though Rigel couldn't make heads or tails of it. By lunch, she was ready to hex both of them, only she didn't actually know any hexes, and she was pretty sure both Pansy and Malfoy had been taught shield charms by their paranoid parents. Then again, if I had as many enemies as the Malfoys, I'd make sure my kids could defend themselves too. Just when she thought they'd gotten over their first charms lesson, Malfoy dragged Pusey into the discussion over the lunch table. "Adrian, how long did it take you to learn the levitation charm?" he asked across the table. "Oh, a while, actually." Pusey scratched his head. "Nearly the whole class period, I think, but then again, my parents were a bit more strict on the rules about underage magic than yours. I never did magic on purpose until I came to Hogwarts." Malfoy and Pansy both looked upset at this. Malfoy, Rigel could understand. If he were looking for something interesting to dish on her, he would be sadly disappointed by her spellcasting skills, of which she had none. Pansy though. Rigel frowned, or at least she let her eyebrows crease together a bit. Perhaps Pansy was regretting making friends with Rigel now that she was revealed to be magically average, or slightly below average, she thought with a mental grimace. Apparently Pusey had been filled in while she was lost in thought, because he turned to her with an expression of surprise and concern. "You couldn't even get it off the table?" She shrugged. "Not even at which Pansy supplied. How nice to have such blunt friends." "Well, how hard were you trying?" Pusey asked. "I tried many times," she said. "My wand movement and pronunciation were correct, it just didn't work." "And you're sure you're not using a fake wand?" Pansy glanced at her sleeve, obviously expecting a rubber chicken to emerge and give the game up. "Yes, I'm sure. 12 inches, ash, unicorn hair." Ollivander called it well balanced. "But wait," Pusey said, "you said that you tried several times, but not how hard you tried." Rigel gazed at him blankly. For Malfoy, it seemed, had run out of patience for the day. She gave him points for almost making it through lunch. "You have to want the magic to work, Black. You can't just wave your wand and expect it to do stuff." "That's right," Pusey said, "intent is crucial when casting a spell, along with concentration and determination." How silly, Rigel thought. In potions you can't get a better result by simply wanting it more. You have to go through the necessary procedure. It's no wonder wizards act like a bunch of spoiled children if most of their needs are met the moment they want it badly enough. But all she said was, "Oh," before turning back to her meal. She chewed on a carrot thoughtfully while Malfoy huffed moodily next to her and the other two gave it up as a bad job altogether. Defense against the dark arts was, if anything, worse than charms. Their professor was a stuttering young man who had apparently had a bad run-in with vampires while on his tour of the continent the year before. Rigel could see why Sirius and her father would think such professors would make easy targets for practical jokes. He did seem to know at least the basics of defense, however, and he started them off trying to light their wand tips with the Lumos spell. Pansy yawned dramatically, and from Malfoy's expression of agreement Rigel assumed this was one of the spells that any kid whose parents weren't strictly law-abiding would have already learned. Which left the two of them with nothing better to do than to tutor Rigel. "No, no, say it more forcefully. Wave your wand like you mean it." Finally she placed her wand on the desk and turned to her little cheerleaders. "Are you two in Hufflepuff?" "What? No." "Then stop badgering me." They both looked highly offended and Pansy grumbled a bit, but they settled for amusing themselves with critiquing the others in their class. Rigel diligently kept at it until the end of the class period, despite what a waste of time it felt like. She added Lumos to the list of spells whose wand movements she had committed to muscle memory, and was glad when class was finally over. They had free time to do homework and the like every day before dinner, so Rigel, Pansy, and Malfoy headed back to the dungeons to work on an assignment Professor Binns had given them. They had to list what they thought were the most important historical events in the last century, but as all three were well versed in recent wizarding history, Pansy and Malfoy because they were taught all wizarding history and Rigel because she read the newspaper, it didn't take too long. Unfortunately, that meant there was plenty of time for them to bug Rigel about her spellcasting. "It's like you're a muggle," Malfoy said. "Maybe I am," she said. Both purebloods flinched back almost involuntarily before their brains caught up. "No, you're not," Pansy said, "you just aren't trying hard enough." "Like, what do you want more than anything else right now?" "I want you to stop bugging me." "Well, that's why it's not working," Malfoy said. "The feather won't float until the thing you want most in the world for one moment is to make it float." "But why would I want to make it float?" she asked reasonably. "It would be easier and faster for me to pick it up." "What if you wanted to move a boulder?" "Can you move a boulder with Wingardium Leviosa?" "Well, no, you need a stronger spell, but just imagine. I can't think of a single time in my life when I've thought to myself, oh if only I could move that boulder." Rigel shrugged. "It just seems rather pointless, I guess." Pansy sighed. "Okay, then what about the Lumos charm?" "It's very useful. But it isn't dark in here." She gestured to the common room. "I have no need of a lit wand." "You are never going to learn magic like that," Malfoy said, his eyes narrowed. Rigel shrugged. After all, she was here to learn potions, not magic. After dinner she retreated to her rooms and started writing a letter to Sirius. She didn't know how to change her handwriting yet, so she used a dictoquill and hoped Sirius assumed his son was just too lazy to write it himself. "Dear Dad. Miss me yet? I miss having my own room already, but the food here is way better than the stuff you cook, ha ha. The train ride was fun, I met a nice boy called Neville, I think he's a Longbottom, and the castle is just as cool and you and Uncle James always said. So don't freak out, but I was sorted into Slytherin, surprise. Don't worry, cause everyone's been really cool to me so far and the other boys in my dorm are nice enough, although some of the girls in our year were giving me looks like they thought I would pounce on them at any moment." "What exactly did you do to their mothers when you were here, Dad?" "My first day of classes went well, but history's really boring. Our Dada professor looks like one good prank would scare him out of his garlic necklace, but I guess I won't know until I try, huh? So yeah, everything's good here, don't worry too much and promise not to turn my bedroom into a pool hall or something, okay? With love. Archie. P.S. The you-know-what still works." She thought it sounded enough like her cousin to pass muster. She was careful not to mention any snaps, Malfoys, or the trouble she was having with spells. No need for Sirius to get upset. If he ever came to visit the school, everything would be ruined. She knew it was going to be imperative that she avoid things like injuries, massive amounts of detentions, or anything else that would give Sirius a reason to show up at Hogwarts. Her acting was good when she bothered, but he was bound to notice she wasn't Archie unless he hit him with a conjunctivitis curse as soon as he walked in the door. Rigel packed away the dictoquill and looked around her dorm. It was still a good 40 minutes until curfew, so neither of her roommates was asleep. Not was playing a game of exploding snap with Zabinai, who was apparently already sick of Dumb and Dumber's illustrious company. Malfoy was, oh great, he appeared to be writing a letter as well. That meant she probably wouldn't be going to the Owlery alone. She pulled out the Marauder's map casually, knowing any suspicious movement would only trigger her fellow Slytherins' notice. She began quietly muttering aloud nonsense phrases, seeming for all the world as if she was reading a portion of her letter out loud under her breath to check the wording. She slipped "I solemnly swear that I am up to no good" in the middle and worked quickly to memorize the fastest route to the Owlery. Wiping the map in the same manner, she tucked it away once more and rolled up her letter as unobtrusively as possible. She pulled on her gloves and wrapped a scarf around her neck snugly. Sirius had charmed Archie's robes to be weather-resistant, so she didn't need a cloak. She stood casually, slipping her letter into the folds of her school robes. She was almost, so close, to the door when, surprise of surprises, Malfoy stopped her. "Going somewhere, Black?" he asked. "Is he going to say that every time it becomes clear that I am, in fact, going somewhere?" She mentally rolled her eyes a bit. "Yes, Malfoy. You're going to send a letter." He said it like an accusation. "You're going to the Owlery." She shrugged noncommittally, which she supposed was as good as an admission. He rose from his bed and began rolling his own letter, saying, "It's only a half hour or so until curfew." "It shouldn't take more than 15 minutes each way," she pointed out. "It took you 20 minutes just to get out of the dungeons this morning," Malfoy said evenly. "I'm coming with you." "There's really no need," Rigel said half-heartedly. Not spoke up from across the room. "Sure there is. You don't to be wandering alone this late at night in Gryff and Claw territory. Weren't you listening to Professor Snape this morning?" "It's no trouble," Malfoy assured her, his grin flashing a bit too much tooth to be completely friendly. "I need to send my letter with Archimedes anyway." A Malfoy would have an owl named Archimedes, she thought, but she gave in with a modicum of good grace. She had expected Malfoy to insist upon coming anyway. They walked down their hall and across the common room in silence, broken only by Malfoy speaking the password to the wall door for them to leave. The dungeons were cold and eerily quiet. Their footsteps echoed as they walked, which she thought would be both an advantage if you needed to hear intruders coming, and a disadvantage if you wanted to move about unseen. She took the turns that led to the entrance hall confidently, and Malfoy seemed content to follow her lead until they reached the ground floor. He turned toward the main stair, which would lead to the connecting stairway that ran up the middle of the castle, while she turned toward the west stairway, which led up the side of the castle. They both stopped and stared at one another. "We should take the main stair," Malfoy said. "We don't know the castle well enough to take side routes, and the more remote an area is, the easier it is to get ambushed there." "Isn't that why you came with me?" "To prevent attack from anyone who might take on a lone snake?" she asked, with a look on her face that said clearly, "You can go wherever you want, but I'm going this way." He made a noise like a smothered sigh in the back of his throat, but walked determinedly over to the west stairs, glaring at her all the time. Rigel ignored his dark look and led them up 3 flights of stairs to the 4th floor, and it wasn't until she turned down a corridor that Malfoy spoke up exasperatedly. "Okay, now I know we're going the wrong way. You're turning east, and the Owlery is next to the west tower. We should have kept going up the next flight of stairs." Rigel kept walking until she reached a tapestry of 2 young wizards dueling over a blonde-haired maiden. She moved the hanging aside and glanced back as if to say, "Coming." Malfoy shut his mouth and eyed the passageway she'd revealed untrustingly. "How do I know this isn't a trap?" he said as he slowly peered into the gloomy space. It was a steep, narrow staircase that seemed to go almost straight up. "Yes, Malfoy, I forced you to follow me to the Owlery so I could get expelled my first night by pushing the Malfoy scion down a flight of stairs," Rigel said. He looked close to huffing, but he pushed past her and started up the stairs nevertheless. He lit his wand with the Lumos spell and sent her a look over his shoulder that said, "See how useful it is." She followed with amusement, calling, "Watch out for step 33. He stopped dead. She could almost hear him counting to 10 in his head before he spoke. Come again. She drew level with him, barely managing it in the narrow passage. We are now on the 24th stair, and I thought you should know that the 33rd step is, in fact, a trap. He stared at her, probably imagining a violent strangulation of the black air. Why don't you go first? She did, gladly, stepping exaggeratedly over the trick stair to make sure Malfoy didn't forget, as amusing as it would have been to watch him become trapped knee-deep in a hidden staircase. They came out of the passage on the 7th floor, a few meters east of the entrance to the owlery stairs. Malfoy pursed his lips, but was too proud to ask her how she'd known the way. Just as well, since she would only have lied and said she heard about it in passing from an older student. They took the steps up to the owlery quickly. It wasn't yet cold enough for the stairs to be icy, but it was close, and the biting wind discouraged any lingering. Rigel went to find a school owl to take her letter and Malfoy whistled sharply for his. Rigel said, Sirius Black very clearly and watched the screech owl fly off into the night. She turned around and saw Malfoy muttering agitatedly to himself beside his eagle owl. She suddenly realized that while she had dressed warmly for her trip to the owlery, which was always freezing because it had to be exposed for the birds to get in and out, Malfoy, being too preoccupied with insisting on accompanying her, hadn't. In that moment, he truly looked his 11 years. His nose was slightly red, as were the tips of his ears, and his hair was a wind-blown mess. He cursed quietly again as he fumbled and dropped his tightly rolled scroll, and Rigel guessed his fingers were numb as well. She stooped down to catch the letter before it could hit the ground and become covered in bird droppings. Malfoy looked up sharply, his usual frozen expression made less effective by the knowledge that he probably was freezing. So she ignored his glower, tied the scroll securely to his stately owl's leg, and said, To your father. None of your business, he snapped. She raised an eyebrow. Shall I plug my ears while you give your owl instructions then? He might have flushed, but it was too cold to tell. Malfoy manner, he told the bird. Rigel eyed the bird as it took flight, wondering how much of that letter was about her, but then shrugged mentally, thinking she might be a little too good at pretending to be her cousin if she was already so vain. She turned back to Malfoy, whose breath was coming in short puffs between lips that had lost most of their color. She took off her scarf and quickly wound it around the pale boy's neck and mouth, effectively muffling his spluttered protests for a few crucial moments. By the time he wrestled his chin free of the thick fabric, she'd stripped off her gloves and roughly grabbed hold of one of his hands, tisking when she found it trembling with cold. What, he started through clenched teeth. Hold these for me, won't you, Malfoy, she said, shoving his hand into one of her already warm gloves and proceeding to do the same with the other. Thanks. You. But Rigel was already headed away from him toward the stairs. Hurry up, Malfoy, we don't want to be late. As long as we're back to the dungeons before curfew, Snape won't take points, he said, moving quickly to catch up, and she noticed his voice was muffled again. She bit her lip to keep from smiling at the picture the youngest Malfoy made with his face half buried in her scarf once more. He looked like a baby bird peeking out of its nest, except he had another nest on the top of his head in the form of his once perfect hair. They walked back to the common room in relative silence, Malfoy choosing not to comment on the way Rigel navigated the dungeons perfectly. He was learning that it was better not to question her, since she never gave a straight answer anyway. At the entrance to their rooms, he quickly divested himself of her scarf and gloves and pushed them into her hands before opening the door and heading for his side of the room without looking back. She stored the articles of clothing into her trunk and took off her shoes, then lay down on her bed and willed sleep to come. Not glanced over at her through his hangings and said, Don't you wear night clothes? Or at least sleep under the covers? No, she said. She had decided it would be stranger for her to change in the bathroom every time she put PJs on than for her to just sleep in her clothes. She'd rather come off as paranoid than have them think she had something to hide. She slept on top of the covers so that if there was an emergency or she was attacked in the middle of the night, she wouldn't be hampered by heavy bedclothes, and between sleeping in her robes and the small fireplace always lit by the elves in the evening, she doubted she'd need them. Not chuckled and let the matter drop, turning away from her onto his side. Rigel stared up at the canopy, thinking over her first day at Hogwarts. She wouldn't know if she'd made the right choice until Friday, but so far it was both better and worse than she'd expected. She had a good, if sometimes nosy, friend in Pansy, and even Malfoy was mildly entertaining at times. On the other hand, classes had been a disaster so far. She didn't expect transfiguration to be much better, though herbology would be fine. She knew a lot about plants, or at least the ones used for potions ingredients. And then she had an entire afternoon of flying class. She sighed quietly to herself, wishing that she didn't have to take all those other, boring classes. All she wanted to do was brew. Soon after, sleep took her away in its arms, and she dreamed peacefully of simmering cauldrons, once again oblivious to the silver stare directed at her from the bed to her right. HP. Draco POV. He stared at the sleeping boy on the next bed over as if he could answer all the questions swimming about in Draco's head. And, Draco thought, he probably could, if he wanted to. But Rigel Black was proving to be most unforthcoming. All day he'd spent with Black, and all he knew about the other boy was that he had a vague interest in potions and was absolutely dismal at magic in general. Not much to write home about, though he had, of course, and usually not enough to warrant any continuing interest on his part, but there was something about Rigel Black that had Draco determined to know more. The boy had apparently gotten hopelessly lost that morning before breakfast, but then, perhaps as a result of that time spent wandering, he had demonstrated complete confidence in navigating the dungeons that very evening. And when in Morgan's name had Black had time to find out about that passage to the 7th floor? He didn't act much like the son of Sirius Black either, from what Malfoy had heard about his mother's cousin. Aside from the casual flirting he exhibited at the welcoming feast, Black seemed quite different, at least personality-wise. He did have his father's hair and eye color, and the aristocratic features so carefully bred into the Black line. Black's eyes were a duller gray than his, but then, he had a silver sheen distinctive to the Malfoys to complement his mother's genes. Rigel Black was quiet, withdrawn, and had no compunction ignoring social norms when it pleased him. He had kept most personal information close to his chest, and yet he had chosen to dictate his letter to his father out loud, which didn't fit at all. And that letter. Draco had been able to hear most of it from where he was writing his own, and either Black was keeping his real personality locked up tight so far or he was out and out lying to his dad. Draco was leaning toward the second, because several of the things in the letter really had been lies. Rigel Black didn't seem the type to be interested in pranks, though Draco knew Sirius and James Potter had been, and his classes most certainly hadn't gone well. Also, Black had been borderline rude to Draco most of the day, but had given up his own scarf and gloves in the owlery like it was nothing. Overall, the boy was extremely contradictory, if not downright suspicious, and Draco would be keeping a close watch on the newest Black regardless of what his mother had to say about it. Sooner or later he'll show his hand, Draco thought, and I'll be there. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. The next morning when Rigel stepped into the common room, she found Pansy sitting quietly on one of the low-backed chairs, glancing through their transfiguration text. The blonde girl was really quite pretty in the pale green light coming through the windows from the lake, Rigel noted objectively. She strode over to her friend and waited for Pansy to acknowledge her. Pansy closed the book neatly and flicked luminous blue eyes up to meet grey ones. "Good morning, Rigel," she said. "Morning." Rigel nodded toward the common room door. "I'm going to take a walk." "I would love to come with you," Pansy grinned, and Rigel noticed she was already dressed to go to breakfast, despite the early hour. She gallantly offered her arm, feeling beyond silly even as Pansy gracefully rose and rested her hand lightly on Rigel's elbow. They left the common room and Rigel led them immediately toward the entrance hall. She thought Pansy's robes and shoes looked too thin for dungeon wear, and she'd already explored the dungeons anyway, so she decided they'd walk the first floor, and perhaps the basement if they had time. Rigel especially wanted to figure out where exactly the painting that led to the kitchens was. As they walked, Rigel learned many things about her friend. Pansy was named after a kind of violet, because her mother was so fond of them, and she was an only child. Her parents had arranged many private tutors for her over the years, so she had come to Hogwarts with a full background in wizarding lore, pureblood etiquette, and magical history, which included extensive knowledge of the most famous and influential people and families in the Western wizarding world. She confided to Rigel that the reason no one had ever tried to have their history professor, Binns, replaced by someone more competent was because most of the students, and especially those from influential families like the Malfoys and Parkinsons, were already so well versed in it. Pansy also mentioned she was interested in taking care of magical creatures in her 3rd year, because when she was younger a herd of unicorns had moved into the forest behind her mansion, which was a wizarding wildlife preserve, and she had been quite close to the beautiful creatures before they had moved on. Rigel had known Pansy was mostly innocent, as any 11-year-old would be, but she hadn't realized just how much it meant to Pansy until then, and she made a silent vow to protect that innocence as much as possible in the next 7 years. By the time they entered the Great Hall for breakfast, Rigel knew that Pansy's favorite color was periwinkle, that she hated the smell of lavender, because she was allergic, and that at present her greatest ambition was to learn to bake, because her grandmother made the most delicious pies and cakes, better than any house elf, but her mother refused to let her practice at home. Rigel found she didn't mind Pansy's company as long as Pansy was content to talk about herself. She reminded Rigel of Archie a bit, the way she carried the whole conversation easily without becoming annoying, at least not to Rigel, who didn't like to talk much. Come to think of it, Draco reminded her a bit of Archie too, the way he impulsively pursued whatever he happened to be interested in at the time. It seemed Rigel had unconsciously drifted toward the familiar here at Hogwarts, however much it had seemed like Pansy and Draco attached themselves to her. They strolled over to the Slytherin table together and Rigel waited politely for Pansy to take a seat before doing so herself, noting as she did so that Pansy had maneuvered her into sitting next to Malfoy once again. She wondered if it was her fate to be ever between the two of them. "Good morning," Pansy said to the General Assembly of First Years. "Where were you two this morning?" Davis asked. "Walking," Pansy said, buttering a scone with care. "It's a rather refreshing way to begin the day." "Just walking?" Greengrass asked lowly, obviously still suspicious of the son of infamous playboy Sirius Black. "There was talking involved as well, I believe," Rigel said. She blinked when Pansy gave a startled laugh. "You have quite a way with understatement, Rigel," she said, eyes twinkling mischievously and looking for all the world as if she had solved a great puzzle. "I knew you must have a sense of humor if you were raised by Sirius Black and James Potter." "I think most of the professors are waiting anxiously for the practical jokes to begin," Zabinai said, a slight smile playing about his mouth, "and the Weasley terrors have spent every meal since the sorting on the edge of their seats with anticipation." Rigel looked with interest at the Gryffindor table, where there did indeed seem to be two identical redheads alternatively glancing around the hall and staring at her with confused expressions. She shrugged her shoulders, saying, "I have no talent for pranks." "Well, as your dorm mate, I am much relieved," Not told her, "and if you ever decide to take up the family mantle, do us a favor and practice on the Hufflepuffs." "I'm not sure that Malfoy and Pansy would take it very well," she said blandly. The others gave her confused looks, but Malfoy kicked her shin below the table and Pansy shoved her lightly. "Rigel thinks he's being funny, by calling us Hufflepuffs because we badgered him so much yesterday," Pansy said, a sweet smile blooming on her face as she began her revenge. "You see, he had a little trouble with the charms we learned, and we were only trying to help, weren't we, Malfoy?" Rigel groaned inwardly as Malfoy answered her, just as sweetly, "We were indeed, and Black's not the only one with a talent for understatement. His attempts were simply abysmal, weren't they, Parkinson?" "Oh, you must call me Pansy," the blonde girl said cheerfully. "After all, we'll be working together a long time if we're to try and teach this plebeian how magic is supposed to be performed." "Then I insist you call me Draco," Malfoy said gallantly, shaking his head sadly at Rigel, "for I do fear we have a long road ahead of us." "See if I sit by you two in Transfiguration," Rigel muttered into her cantaloupe. "Oh, you will, if only because we sit by you," Pansy assured her. Rigel supposed she deserved it for calling them puffs in front of their yearmates, but now everyone half suspected she was a squib, if their looks her way were any indication. 10 minutes later they followed a prefect to Transfiguration, where a cat sat silently on the professor's empty desk. Rigel stared at the cat, a suspicion forming in her mind. She'd been around animagi for the whole of her childhood, and between Sirius, James, and Remus when he was on Wolfspan, she knew an animal that was not an animal when she saw one. Sure enough, as the clock on the wall chimed the hour, the cat leapt off the desk, transforming midair into the stern-faced woman who'd met them before their sorting. Most of the class released quiet gasps, and looked at their neighbors in awe. Professor McGonagall strode to the blackboard and waved her wand at a piece of chalk. It animated and began writing out notes on theory while she introduced herself and called roll. "Welcome to Transfiguration," she said, not sounding at all welcoming, This is a very difficult subject and I expect you all to work hard and apply yourselves to it. There will be no fooling around in here. Next to potions, it is perhaps the branch of magic where things can most easily go wrong if you aren't extremely careful. Mr. Black, she called. Rigel contained her jump, but knew she must have still looked startled. Yes. You knew or guessed I was not all I seemed when you first walked in, she commented. Rigel wondered just how she had figured that out, but said, yes. How? You were too still, Rigel said, referring to the professor's cat form. Cats are naturally quiet animals, but you were very watchful, so I guessed you were a human in animal form. Why not just assume I was a familiar or some other intelligent animal, she pressed. Rigel sensed she was the kind of professor who always wanted the most complete answer possible. She couldn't tell the class that her father and uncle were unregistered animagi, so she just shrugged, saying, all of our professors have been in the classroom when we arrived so far. I noticed you left the staff table before we finished breakfast, and the markings around your eyes were unusual for a tabby cat. Excellent observational skills, McGonagall nodded briskly, 5 points to Slytherin. It is vital that you begin to develop an awareness for magic at all times. Magic can be used to deceive the unsuspecting, especially transfiguration, which is the magic of turning one thing into another, but there are almost always signs, if you remember to look for them. She spent the rest of the lesson teaching them to turn matches into needles, and Pansy and Malfoy predictably had much better luck than Rigel did. Mine's gone silver, I think, Pansy noted, beaming. They had been warned that the chances of anyone succeeding the first day were slim. I think I've got a hole in one end of mine, Malfoy added, looking quite pleased. The two of them turned to Rigel expectantly and she glanced down at her match. Oh, look, I've made a match, she said, feigning a dreamy sort of joy. They both sighed at her, so she gave a small, but real smile and said, you both did very well. I'm so proud, she added, just to see them scowl at her again. They looked like twins when they did that, side by side, both pale-skinned with blonde hair and expressions of amused exasperation on their faces. You're impossible, Malfoy said, at this rate they'll kick you out by the end of the week, and then Pansy will cry, and Zab and I will move into our dorm to get away from the Numbskull brothers, and I heard he snores. I'll miss out on my beauty sleep, and Pansy won't be able to use her glamour spells on me. I do not use a glamour. Because she'll be too distraught and crying, and I'll grow up to be ugly and therefore uninfluential, and it will be all your fault, he finished grandly. Rigel rolled her eyes and turned back to her match, figuring she could at least practice the incantation some more. She felt Malfoy glaring at her like she'd committed some unconscionable crime by not being talented like he was, as Pansy chewed his ear off about the glamour comment, and wished fervently that she had something pointy to job him with so the superior jerk would stop bothering her. Pansy broke off her tirade with a gasp and Malfoy stared dumbly down at her match, except it wasn't a match anymore. It was a needle. Oh, well done, Mr. Black. Professor McGonagall had come over to check their work and seen her needle transform. 10 more points to Slytherin. Mr. Malfoy, Miss Parkinson, you have made very good attempts as well. As soon as she walked away, Pansy squealed, 15 points to Slytherin in one class. Malfoy shot her a look that said focus. Black, how in Merlin's name did you do that? Same as you, only better. Rigel smirked, quite shocked at herself but unwilling to show it. You didn't even say the incantation, he whispered fiercely. The look of awed pleasure on his face made Rigel uncomfortable, so she lied, yes I did, you must not have heard it over Pansy's nattering. He looked unconvinced, but still, you were dismal at charms and defense, and this is supposed to be much harder. What did you do differently? Pansy asked, I mean, what were you thinking when you did it? I was thinking I'd like something to poke Malfoy's eye out, Rigel said. Pansy looked like she couldn't tell if Rigel was joking or not. I guess maybe you just needed the right motivation, then. Malfoy smirked and this time Rigel did groan softly, so this means we can annoy you in every class. In fact, we're practically obligated to. Pansy and I are the key to your success. After transfiguration, on the way to herbology, Zab and I approached them. Rigel didn't know much about the boy, besides what people said about his dangerously beautiful mother, but he had a quiet presence when he spoke, despite his young age. I noticed your success in McGonagall's class, he said casually. Looks like those two were exaggerating this morning. He nodded at her friends. And when did Malfoy become one of her friends? You seem to be full of surprises. I think it was just a fluke, Rigel said. Perhaps that particular match had been a needle before. Aha, the dark boy raised an eyebrow. In any case, Slytherin House seems to have gained a valuable and unexpected asset in you, Black. Likewise, I'm sure. Zabina. Rigel nodded politely as they reached the greenhouses and Professor Sprout ushered them inside the first one. Professor Sprout was a very interesting teacher, Rigel thought. She set them to examining different kinds of soils and guessing what types of magical plants would grow best in each one. Rigel knew about the properties of a lot of plants, but she'd never known that the growing conditions had so much impact on the potency of a plant's magical properties and parts. She was shocked to discover that if grown in the wrong soil, Flitterbloom lost half of its nutritional value, so for a vitamin potion to be up to standard it would require twice as much. She would have to start asking where the ingredients she purchased were grown before using them in her potions. After herbology they were all slightly dirty, but no one bothered cleaning up before lunch since they all had flying that afternoon, and were bound to work up a sweat again. Malfoy was practically vibrating in his seat. He was so excited, although his face was stoic as always. Rigel put a hand on his arm the fourth time his leg bumped into hers because he couldn't stop himself from bouncing it, and he finally calmed enough to finish his lunch with some decorum. She shared an amused glance with Pansy, who was completely unimpressed by the idea of flying on a broom in general. They had flying with the Gryffindors, and the barrier between the houses was never more apparent to Rigel than the moment they reached the pitch and the Gryffs lined up along one side while the Slytherins took the other. She recognized Neville from the train and smiled slightly, as much as she ever did, in his direction when he noticed her. Pansy was giving a girl called Lavender an ugly look, probably hating her just on principle because of her allergy, and Malfoy was staring down the gangly redhead she knew was related to the Weasley twins, probably a younger brother. The boy looked just as unhappy to be looking at Malfoy, and Rigel thought she'd have to keep them away from one another if she wanted a peaceful existence at Hogwarts. Madam Hooch blew her whistle to get their attention and said, "Today we're just going to cover the basics. I know many of you have brooms of your own at home, and will likely think this review beneath you, but if you plan to play Quidditch for your house, you'll want to be sure you have the fundamentals down. Don't worry," she grinned like a shark, "if you've been doing it wrong your whole life, I'll tell you." Completely unreassured, the class nevertheless followed her directions and started screaming, "Up!" at their brooms. Malfoy rolled his eyes and snapped his fingers imperiously at the old comet beside him and said, "Up." It flew into his hand as if it had just been waiting for an opportunity to do so. Pansy got hers to roll over a few times, and eventually got fed up and just picked it up off the ground with a scowl on her face. Rigel said, "Up," in a tone that was apparently not convincing enough for her shooting star. Malfoy, who was on Rigel's right, looked over and said, "It's the same thing as a Wingardium Leviosa, but the broom channels the magic instead of your wand. You have to mean it, Black." "Why can't I pick it up like Pansy did?" she asked, knowing full well what Malfoy was going to say. "Because you'll never learn that way." He shot Pansy a look around Rigel and said, "Pansy doesn't want to learn, but you should take this seriously." "Why?" she said, deciding Malfoy was much more fun exasperated. She wondered how long she could pretend to be bad at Quidditch just to annoy him. "I don't want to learn either." He frowned at her. "You have to like Quidditch. If Pansy doesn't like it, you have to, so that I'm not the only one in our group." She raised her eyebrows at his rather childish reasoning, trying to ignore the part of her that was flattered that he considered her and Pansy's opinions the only ones worth considering. "Fine," she said, "up." The broom rose steadily to her waiting hand and the wood seemed to thrum with anticipation beneath her fingers. She looked regretfully down at the old broom, knowing it would be ever so disappointed when she acted ignorant in the air. Still, if people knew she wasn't horrible on a broom they would want her to try out for the house team, and that would detract from her potion studies. Not to mention the unwanted attention if she did somehow make the team, coupled with the inevitable hijinks that came with trying to hide her biological gender in changing rooms, etc. Add to that the 100% probability that if her Uncle Sirius came to watch her play he'd realize instantly she wasn't Archie, and there was no way she could afford to be good at Quidditch. "Mount your brooms," Madam Hooch called, demonstrating how they were to swing one leg over to the other side. Everyone got more or less situated and she said, "Now, on the count of 3 I want all of you to push lightly off the ground, hover for a moment, then come back down by leaning forward slightly. 1. But Neville was already in the air, and rising steadily. The class gasped, and the round-faced boy gripped the broom tightly, his face chalk white with terror. Hooch pushed off the ground and flew toward him, stretching out a hand to try and pull him to safety, but by the time she reached him, Neville's grip had failed. He plummeted straight down and Rigel barely had time to think, as she watched with frozen dismay, that if she ever wanted to make anything levitate in her whole life, it was Neville, right now. Then, amazingly, he was slowing, stopping, hovering a few inches above the ground, and Rigel realized she was holding her wand with the tip pointed directly at the stunned Gryffindor. His milky hazel eyes met hers and the look of abject gratitude in them made her hand tremble. The spell broke and Neville landed with a relieved exhalation of breath on the soft grass. Hooch landed a few seconds after, and helped the boy to his feet. When it was clear that he was shaking too much to stand, she said, "Poor boy, you've had quite a scare. Let's get you to the hospital wing for a calming draft." She swung him up into her arms, showing surprising strength, and called over her shoulder, "Stay here and keep on the ground or you'll be in detention until you graduate." Rigel had hurriedly stowed her wand away when Neville hit the ground, but it was too late to avoid detection, and most of the class was staring at her. She could see the Gryffindors being torn between relief that their classmate hadn't been hurt and suspicion that a slimy snake would help a lion for seemingly no reason. Her own housemates were just plain gaping at her, having been under the impression that she couldn't even perform the levitation charm, much less on a heavy, moving object under pressure. Rigel, not wanting to examine that line of questioning herself, turned pointedly to Pansy and said, "Do you think Professor Sprout will care where we get the soil sample we're supposed to analyze for our homework assignment?" Pansy just blinked at her, at a loss for coherence. Rigel sighed and turned to Malfoy. "I mean, she can't expect us to traipse through the Forbidden Forest, right? We could probably just ask the gamekeeper for a sample from his garden." Malfoy looked like he was considering slapping her, so she narrowed her eyes and snapped, "Stop looking at me like I'm hysterical. Just drop it." "Drop," he swore softly, "you are beyond words sometimes, and that is not a compliment." She shrugged, and was about to change the subject again when she noticed the red-headed Gryffindor walking their way. With a foreboding feeling in her stomach, she put on the friendliest expression she could muster while still kind of freaking out inside. "Hey," he began hotly. Rigel interrupted, "Hey, you know Neville, right?" Yeah, of course." The redhead frowned, "He's in our dorm, but..." "Great," she smiled stiffly, "can you tell him I hope he's okay when you see him next?" "Well, sure." I guess he looked very confused now. "Oh, of course, how rude of me." Rigel stuck her hand in the Gryffindor's face. "I'm Rigel Black." "If you just tell him," Rigel said high, "he'll know who you mean." "Ron Weasley." He scrutinized her hand carefully, which made Pansy huff angrily. "It's fine, Pansy," Rigel said soothingly. "If my brothers were the Weasley twins, I'd be in the habit of looking for pranks everywhere too." "On my honor, it's just a hand," she said to Weasley. He had the decency to flush embarrassedly at being called out for his rudeness, but seized on the excuse as he shook her hand briefly. "Can't be too careful with those two." "I understand," Rigel assured him seriously. Malfoy was glaring something fierce at Weasley, but Rigel hoped he would keep his comments to himself. The Gryffindor seemed to remember suddenly why he'd come over in the first place, and said aggressively, "Why'd you stop Neville from falling?" "I didn't realize my intervening would offend anyone," she said, deciding that bluffing and acting as if she'd meant to do it would be best for now. "I'll be sure to leave it to you next time." "That's not I mean, he bit his lip in open frustration. "What's in it for you?" "It's always a tragedy when good blood goes to waste," she said. "The Longbottom family is very ancient, and it would be a shame for their line to die out from such an avoidable accident." She was actually rather proud of that response. She thought it sounded appropriately pure-blooded and mercenary considering the reputation of her house. Weasley looked as if all his worst fears had been realized, so she must have said something right, and he scoffed dismissively at her before starting to walk back to his side of the pitch. Perhaps it would have ended there if only Malfoy had kept his big mouth shut. He snorted rather rudely, "Oh yes, what a tragedy to lose someone with so much potential to grow up into a snot-nosed muggle-loving blood traitor like his parents." Weasley immediately drew his wand, and said a spell so fast Rigel reflected later that he was probably just waiting for an excuse. A jet of sickly yellow light shot toward Malfoy, who looked gobsmacked at the idea of anyone actually attacking him for what he probably considered casual banter. Pansy shrieked angrily, but it was Rigel who unthinkingly moved sideways to push Malfoy out of the path of the Jinx. It struck her in the shoulder and knocked her backwards into the grass. Distantly she heard Pansy shriek again and Malfoy shout something angrily while Weasley stuttered that it was supposed to have hit Malfoy. This of course didn't make Malfoy any happier, and as Rigel sat up slowly, wondering at the ache in her elbow where she'd hit the ground, she saw Weasley running back toward his housemates while Crabbe and Goyle held Malfoy back from pursuing. "What a funny little picture," she said blearily. "I do hope someone tells Malfoy he looks like an angry Scottish terrier right now." Pansy turned toward her at the sound of her voice and said, "Draco, come here. Rigel's fine." Malfoy whipped his head around and broke angrily from Crabbe and Goyle's hold. He strode over to where Rigel was still sitting happily in the dirt and crouched down next to Pansy. "You all right, Black?" "I'm all wrong," she said, smiling stupidly into his concerned face. "Like my eyes?" "These aren't my eyes. I've stolen yours, I'm afraid." "What?" He frowned down at her. "Black, you're not making any sense." "You can't make sense," she said wisely, "you have to find it." This statement struck her as funny, so she flopped back onto the ground and laughed heartily at the sky, asking it pretty please to rain honey for a day or two in her head. "What's wrong with him?" Malfoy demanded. "Weasley, what the bloody hell did you do to him?" "It was just a jellylegs Jinx," Weasley yelled, still red in the face but looking slightly worried too. "It wasn't supposed to even knock him down." "A jellylegs Jinx is orange-red in color," Zabinai said coldly, peering down at Rigel. "That one looked more like a Jellybrains Jinx to me." "Jellybrains?" Pansy started shrieking again. "You turned his brains to jelly." "Pan, it's okay," Rigel said in her best calming tone, which came out a bit on the giggly side. "The sky is going to rain honey for me tomorrow, and if we have jelly too then everyone can have toast." Malfoy growled, "You better get your ass over here and fix him this instant, you stupid git, or my father is going to." "What in Merlin's name is going on here?" Madam Hooch was back, and she looked like an Amazon queen ready to call down a storm. "Mr. Black, are you all right?" "No." Pansy said hysterically, "No, he's not all right, he's got jelly for brains." The flying instructor pulled Rigel up into a sitting position once more by her shoulders and stared intently into Rigel's face. "The Jellybrains Jinx, was it?" "Not to worry, Miss Parkinson, it'll wear off in a few minutes." "Who is responsible for this?" Weasley Malfoy ground out. "This is how the Gryffindors decided to repay Black for saving their useless housemate's life." "I didn't do that," Rigel said earnestly. "It was my wand what did it. I was just holding it at the time." "You shouldn't be so angry," she added, looking sadly at her blonde friend. "It makes your eyebrows twitch something terrible." Pansy choked on a laugh and flung her arms around Rigel. "You idiot. Why would you do such a thing? Seriously." Black Malfoy was scowling now. "Of the three of us, you're the only one who hasn't been taught a shield charm yet. What gives you the right to jump in front of an unknown spell, huh?" Rigel carefully disentangled herself from Pansy. "I'd rather you didn't hug me, Pan," she said. "I don't want your mother to get the wrong idea." Pansy chuckled wryly. "Why would she get the wrong idea? Don't you like me like that?" "I'm crushed, really. I thought you might be Rigel's side. It's all Sirius' fault. He made all the girls afraid of me, so now I'm stuck being friends with a Malfoy." "I'd resent that if you were in your right mind," Malfoy said. "Consider yourself blessed to even be worthy of my presence." "Are you an angel, then, Malfoy?" She grinned. "You look a bit like one, but without a halo it's hard to be sure." Madam Hooch blew her whistle and announced that the class was dismissed, so Pansy and Malfoy stood her up and marched her as quickly as possible back to the castle, throwing dirty looks at the Gryffindors on their way off the pitch. The Jinx didn't wear off until they were almost back to the common room, at which point she groaned, pulled away from their hold, and gripped her head fiercely. "Rigel?" Pansy asked cautiously. "I know why it's called the Jellybrains Jinx now," she moaned through her pounding headache. "It's because your head feels like it's been squished like a grape when it wears off." "Seriously, ouch." Her friends let out twin sighs of relief. "Thank Merlin," Malfoy drawled. "I don't think I could take another minute of the inanities that were dribbling out of your mouth." "Oh, hush," Draco Pansy said softly, trying not to cause Rigel any more pain. "He took that curse for you, after all." "Nobody asked him to," Malfoy muttered. "You're welcome," Rigel said, heading toward the inconspicuous stretch of wall up ahead. "Ouroboros." They caught up with her as she entered the common room, and an unspoken agreement was made not to bring up the flying lesson, Neville's near fall, or Rigel's stint in La La Land for the rest of the day, at least. They worked on their herbology assignment until dinner. Well, Pansy and Draco did theirs and Rigel pretended to work while thinking about potions, and Rigel went to bed early that evening, exhausted and confused by the day's events. Little did she know that she wasn't the only one. Pansy and Draco both lay awake that night, thinking that there was much more to their new friend than either of them would have imagined when they'd met him just 2 days before. End of Chapter 5.